Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rich Freer. I'm the Dean of the Law School here at Emory, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture and Panel Discussion. We welcome the law school and broader Emory University communities, students, staff, and faculty, and we welcome our visitors from the legal community and the broader Atlanta communities as well. Thank you so much for joining us on this important occasion. And great thanks as well to our extraordinary events and inclusion and community teams here at Emory for making this event possible. Emory Law has been hosting the MLK Lecture since 2017. Our keynote speakers through the years have included Dorothy Roberts, Reverend Raphael Warnock, Cornell Brooks, Janai Nelson, and our own colleague, Darren Hutchinson. Today, we are proud to add Crystal McElrath to that list, as well as to welcome our distinguished panelists and moderator. I am delighted at this point to introduce my colleague, Kenyatta Greer. Kenyatta Greer is our Senior Director of Communication and the Director of Inclusion and Community here at the Law School. Kenyatta, I turn it over to you with great thanks for your leadership.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you again for being here. We should measure the prosperity of a nation not by the number of millionaires, but by the absence of poverty, the prevalence of health, the efficiency of public schools, and the number of people who can and do read worthwhile books. W.E.B. Du Bois. The causes which destroyed the ancient republics were numerous, but in Rome, one principal cause was the vast inequality of fortunes. Noah Webster. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. William Shakespeare. Everybody's talking about hard times like it just started yesterday. People I know, they've been struggling, at least it seems that way. Fat cats on Wall Street, they got a bailout, while somebody else got to wait. $700 billion, but my old neighborhood, ain't nothing changed but the date. Prince Rogers Nelson. Good afternoon. As you've heard, I'm Kenyatta Greer, Senior Director of Communication and Director of Inclusion and Community here at Emory Law. In that latter position, I head the Council on Belonging, which is the group tasked with leading and aggregating the work of diversity and inclusion here. It is the pleasure of the Council and my literal delight to open today's event. Thank you, Dean Freer, for your steadfast support of my efforts in this space. Thank you to every Emory faculty member and student I see in the audience today. Thank you to community members and staff. My friends often say I'm weak as water because I'm prone to emotion, and I always correct them to say I'm strong as water. And today I'm feeling really strong. Okay. Your interest in this vital component of Dr. King's work touches me on a personal level. It also advances the work of legal scholars and policymakers, thought leaders and citizens, as we learn more about our systems and how interconnected our decisions are. Allow me to introduce today's keynote speaker, a person whose experience and training make her a much more valuable speaker on this topic than I could ever be. She is Crystal McElrath. Before I do that, please note that the full biography of each of today's speakers is accessible through the QR code on the screen above me. Crystal Stevens McElrath is a senior supervising attorney on the Southern Poverty Law Center's Economic Justice Advocacy and Litigation team, a recent candidate for state court judge, and a graduate of Emory's Center for the Study of Law and Religion. After attending the University of Virginia, she obtained her Master of Theological Studies from Emory University's Candler School of Theology at the same time as her Juris Doctor at Emory University School of Law. In 2015, Crystal also obtained a certificate in nonprofit management from Duke University. Professionally, she spent 12 years in private practice, rising to the rank of partner at the mid-sized litigation firm of Swift, Curry, McGee, and Ayers before joining SPLC. In her current role, she supports a team of staff attorneys in litigation, which challenges policies and practices that exploit Black and Brown communities across the Deep South. She brings a background in discrimination law, which has assisted her in building Title VI discrimination cases in communities that have been denied access to federal funds and benefits, among other things. In 2020, the Daily Report's Georgia Legal Awards named her to its annual On the Rise list. And in 2024, Emory University's Alumni Association named her to its annual 40 Under 40. For 2 decades, she has remained active in her community via her work with the DeKalb Rape Crisis Center, Boyce Ansley School, Georgia High School Mock Trial Competition, Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, Open Hand Atlanta, Pro Bono Partnership in Atlanta, RIP Medical Debt, and Lasagna Love. We got to talk about that. Crystal is conversational in Spanish and currently learning American Sign Language. She is an Atlanta Ballet season subscriber and lifelong Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But her favorite pastime is cooking healthy, flavorful dinners, which her school-age children will refuse to eat. I'd like to say gracias y thank you to Crystal for being here. Join me in welcoming and honoring her.
Thank you all. It is an absolute privilege to be here before you today. To see Professor Whitty and Professor Broyd in the back and the staff of the Sizzler. I mean, it is truly, truly a privilege to stand before Dean Freer and this group of people that I respect so much and have taken so much from. This space that has been so good to me and has enabled and encouraged so many of the academic and ethical and even just personal pursuits, just everything that I wanted to sit with and ponder, I have been able to do so here in this very space, on this very floor. So I'm so grateful to be here and share where I am and what that has turned into. And discussing this topic in particular, which is of paramount importance to me. Today, on the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we recognize that exclusively quoting his views on nonviolence and love often serves to neuter the radical and powerful messages rooted in economic justice. A bit about myself, I'll get closer, a bit about myself and my personal relationship with economic justice. I am the granddaughter of 2 steel mill workers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Both of my grandfathers worked good jobs by the definition of Reverend Dr. King. They had pensions. Their kids attended desegregated schools. But by the time I was born, the steel mills were closed. And I described the area of my upbringing as just simply poor and hopeless in abandoned mill towns. My father obtained an associate's degree from a school that ultimately lost its accreditation, but he learned computers. And nonetheless, it gave him the skills he needed for economic mobility. So fast forward 25 years, I, a newly minted partner at a mid-law firm, was shocked by the financial benefits and advantages exclusively offered to those who are affluent, rather than to those who might need them most. The PMI, private mortgage insurance, that had burdened my family growing up was entirely optional once I entered a different socioeconomic bracket. And this, combined with several other factors, including what I'll call the disdain that I heard some of my new neighbors and colleagues use when speaking to and about folks with fewer resources. It kind of led me to the conclusion, America hates poor people. Matthew Desmond, in his book, Poverty by America, put it this way: poverty persists because people wish and will it to. A tenured law professor commented on a post for this very event today, poverty is often deserved through a lack of contribution to the welfare of others. Reverend Dr. King explained in a 1966 editorial entitled The Last Steep Ascent, Quote, but many white people of even reasonably good will simply know too little of the agony of ghetto existence to make slums a dispensable standard of social and economic justice. So today I'd like to sit in that editorial, the last few percent, and offer some examples from my work in racial and economic justice, which highlight the definitions of poverty and economic injustice offered by Reverend Dr. King and by modern experts. Of course, I cannot say much about current and forthcoming litigation, but let's at least describe the agony of living in poverty. More than 1 million of our public school children are homeless. More than 2 million Americans don't have running water or a flushing toilet at home. And that 2 million number is not including those with inhibited or inconsistent access. Navajo drive hours to fill barrels. Diseases that are long considered eradicated have reemerged in parts of rural America and often the poorest communities due to broken sanitation systems that expose people to raw sewage. Broken sanitation and broken water systems plague communities that I work with in Alabama and in Mississippi. The Black Belt of Alabama. In the Black Belt of Alabama, conventional on-site water systems, or most commonly called septic systems as we discuss them in common parlance, are incompatible with the impermeable Black Belt soil. When improperly installed, these systems fail. So low-income residents resort to straight piping, bath water and wastewater away from their homes. Straight piping it refers to a system of ditches or crudely constructed piping systems that guide wastewater away from residences. The state of Alabama simultaneously denies individuals access to funds that are earmarked for wastewater and penalizes individual residents without adequate on-site sanitation through both fines as well as criminal statutes. So state law allows the Department of Public Health to compel connections to private disposal systems, the costs of which are recoverable through a lien placed on residents' properties. The EPA has stepped in and obtained a moratorium on those enforcement measures. And my clients and I have asked the EPA to also investigate whether Alabama's law violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act by disproportionately burdening low-income Black residents with the refusal to allow them to apply for those wastewater funds. Jackson, Mississippi. On August 29, 2022, floodwaters from the Pearl River overwhelmed the city of Jackson's primary water treatment. It left over 150,000 residents without water. 80% of the residents of Jackson are Black. It was in 2022 that the term the Jackson water crisis entered public discourse, but the crisis had been going on for decades. In 2019, 3 billion gallons of sewage water had been dumped into the Pearl River. The Pearl River was the same river that flooded in 2022 and overwhelmed the primary treatment plant. Similarly, in 2020, record rainfall in the first 3 months of the year overflowed the city's sewage system and dumped nearly 500 million gallons of raw sewage and 5.7 billion gallons of minimally treated sewage into the Pearl River. All the while, the city was begging the state to provide financial assistance. Instead, when the federal government sent billions of dollars to Mississippi under the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, for pandemic-related expenses and for water, sewer, and broadband improvements, Mississippi legislators passed a law singling out the city of Jackson as the only municipality or city whose federal funds would be held by the state. They still have not gained access to that money. The experience of poverty persists because people wish and will it to do so. The cost of water has doubled and tripled in many places over the last decade. Much of this is due to failing infrastructure all over the country. Pipes that were built and laid 100 years ago were only intended to last 50 to 60 years, so they should have been replaced decades ago. The cost of failing to replace or maintain systems is being passed on to customers. Again, that's everywhere. But moreover, the cost to repair infrastructure are higher now when you're dealing with an emergency cost. It's cheaper to maintain pipes as part of a capital improvement plan than it is to repair them when they burst. So in a rural Black community just outside of Mobile, residents have become used to receiving $300, $600, $800 monthly water bills. This is in addition to the hundreds of dollars they spend buying bottled water, which is safe enough to drink. I find myself enraged at the insult of these folks having to pay inaccurately high water bills for water that they don't even feel safe consuming or using. So my work has been focused on engaging the government as well as private parties there in Mobile to ensure access to safe and affordable water. A family without access to clean and affordable water may see their whole life fall apart. Families may be forced to choose between utility bills and food or medical treatment. Lack of clean water can exacerbate health risks, and many individuals will become more susceptible to illnesses they cannot afford to treat. A child who cannot bathe regularly may suffer psychosocial-emotional harm tied to insecurity and low self-worth. The child may not be able to focus in school and may be more likely to fall behind, even repeating a grade. It's not an exaggeration to say a lack of clean water in a home is tantamount to an eviction. A parent or guardian may choose to send their child to live in a different home, thus breaking up the home. In some states, lack of clean water can be a factor contributing to a loss of custody. And lack of water can violate the terms of housing subsidies, causing families to lose their housing altogether. Disparities in access to clean water and sanitation follow the same lines as redlining and segregation in almost every area. Black residents are 2 times more likely to live in a community with lead service lines. In Chicago, there was lead infrastructure throughout the entire city by mandate at one point. But by 2020, the only remaining lead service lines were in low-income Black and brown service areas. Intentional decisions were being made at that point. Flint, Michigan is another place. Intentional decisions are being made here. Poverty in America persists because people wish and will it to do so. According to a pre-pandemic report from the Children's Defense Fund, about 1 in 7 children were poor. Almost half of these children lived in extreme poverty at less than half of the poverty level. Nearly 3 in 4 children, about 71% at the time, were children of color. The youngest children were most likely to be poor, with nearly 1 in 6 children under the age of 5 living in poverty during those years of rapid brain development. Within the 5 deep South states served by my organization, over 50% of the public school students live below the poverty line. But poverty isn't a line, despite common references to the systems of calculations that have become known as the poverty line. Poverty is a tight knot of social maladies connecting every social problem we care about: crime, health, education, and housing. Being born poor or growing up in poverty is the single most significant indicator of poor health outcomes: low quality education, domestic community violence, and encounters with the police or the criminal legal system. Children living in poverty are also more likely to live in poverty as adults. So 5 years after Reverend Dr. King's The Last Steep Ascent, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that inequitable access to utilities was the legacy of segregated housing. The case was Hawkins versus Town of Shaw, Mississippi. It's a 1971 case that outlined a 14th Amendment equal protection claim for municipal services. Quote, in concluding that an equal protection violation has occurred, we have not, of course, been guided by a statutory set of standards or regulations clearly defining how many paved streets or what kind of sewage systems a town like Shaw should have. We have, however, been able to utilize what we consider a most reliable yardstick, namely the quality and quantity of municipal services provided in the white area of town. The disparities are by no means slight, end quote. Nearly 98% of all homes that front unpaved streets in Shaw were occupied by Blacks. 97% of the homes were not served by sanitary sewers were in Black neighborhoods. Further, while the town had began the process of updating streetlights, every single one of the new streetlights had been installed in white neighborhoods. Quote, the record further discloses that similar statistical evidence of grave disparities in both the level and kinds of services offered regarding surface water drainage, water mains, fire hydrants, and traffic control apparatus was also brought forth and not disputed, end quote. In addressing the sewage and drainage issues similar to those I'm still seeing in Alabama, the 1971 Fifth Circuit said, regarding the other impediments, we note only that they have been substantially overcome in white neighborhoods. We see no acceptable reason why they should not have been overcome in the Black community as well. The Fifth Circuit took note of allegations that the disparity in municipal services was the result of a long history of racial discrimination, prima facie evidence of racial discrimination with no evidence of a justifying, compelling state interest. In Color of Law, the book Color of Law, Richard Rothstein outlines this long history, the way state and local governments affirmatively ensured white Americans would not have to live near Black Americans. And my own work bears witness that for BIPOC communities in America, the insult of being displaced from ancestral land, often repeatedly and over multiple generations, is compounded by government enacted and sanctioned segregation and institutional discrimination, which denied equitable access to place-based determinants of economic stability. Those determinants include access to education, transportation, and infrastructure. Moreover, the legal systems that have upheld and perpetuated those harms have provided no legal guidance on how to repair those harms. Some of my economic justice work focuses on preventing the displacement of people experiencing poverty. Interestingly, shockingly, the government likes to tell poor people that there are no legal mechanisms to prevent the taking of their land, but rarely does the government insist that it must take land from affluent landowners. In the 1970s, the state of Georgia purchased most of the land on Sapelo Island, Georgia, from a wealthy white businessman. And then the state began analyzing legal options to acquire the land belonging to 150 families, mostly Gullah Geechee descendants of enslaved West Africans. The office of the Georgia Attorney General was exchanging inter-office memorandum in 1979, wherein it was determined that the state's best options were zoning, if the desire was to control development, or eminent domain, if, quote, for reasons unknown to the author, the state remained focused on owning that land. Today, on Sapelo Island, Georgia's last remaining Gullah Geechee community is fighting efforts to rezone them off of their land, while the state maintains that rezoning increases the value of their land. And let me correct that, while the county maintains that rezoning increases the value of their land, it may also increase taxes and effectively allow private predatory developers to swipe in and acquire the land. The ABA Journal reports that by 1997, Black farmers in America had lost 90% of the 16 million acres they owned in 1910. Every time I speak on my land justice work, a Black American in the crowd tells me after the fact how their family also has a similar story of losing acres of land. In both Florida and Georgia, my team has opposed the use of eminent domain to run turnpike extensions and railroad spurs, respectively, through the acres of land acquired by formerly enslaved peoples and held in their families for generations. If there's anything I want to leave with you today, it's this: the lingering effects of redlining, housing discrimination, and land theft demand innovative lawyering in the areas of infrastructure, utility justice, medical debt, and access to health care. And I hope Emory Law School will be at the forefront of supplying these innovative lawyers equipped to meet that demand. Reverend Dr. King noted, slums with hundreds of thousands of living units are not eradicated as easily as lunch counters or buses are integrated. Jobs are harder to create than voting rolls. It's easy to conceive of a plan to raise the minimum wage and thus in a single stroke extract millions of people from poverty. But between the conception and the realization, there lies a formidable wall. Someone has been profiting from the low wages of Negroes. Depressed living standards for Negroes are a structural part of the economy. Certain industries are based upon the supply of low-wage, underskilled, and immobile non-white labor. No one has been told what slum elimination actually entails, what the transition from equality to opportunity really involves. One is forced to believe that the answers have not been forthcoming because there is no genuine conviction that such a fundamental change need be on any early agenda. I imagine my work in economic justice over the next few years will focus on utility justice, as I have already discussed a bit, in addition to protecting public benefits. And let me flag here that for Reverend Dr. King, racial justice and economic justice were inextricably intertwined. Yet poverty is not a Black problem. My work around public benefits often crosses racial lines. Since the creation of temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, sometimes now known as welfare, in 1996, states in the Deep South have drastically reduced the amount of money used to provide basic cash assistance to families. In Georgia, 65% of TANF funds went directly to needy families in 1996. In 2018, that number was 20%. In Mississippi, the number fell from 64% to 5% over those same years. Mississippi, of course, has come under a lot of public scrutiny for how their TANF funds were used. Since TANF can be used at state discretion for any of four purposes: preventing out-of-wedlock childbirth, encouraging two-parent families, ending dependence on government benefits by promoting job preparation, and providing assistance to needy families so children can be cared for in their homes, Mississippi is free to spend 34% of its TANF funds on work programs. They were also free to use those funds to pay celebrities for speeches on fatherhood. There's been a movement to attach public benefits to work requirements, many of which I believe actually violate labor laws. Program participants are required to volunteer at assigned locations for as many as 20 hours per week in order to receive the average monthly stipend of about $220, which means that the beneficiaries receive as little as $2.75 per hour. And if they walk away from those volunteer assignments, they risk losing other stipends, even if their reason for walking away from those assignments might be discrimination, which is also protected under federal law. Meanwhile, data clearly shows that providing a larger short-term stipend is far more effective to lift families out of poverty. Rather than providing a family $220 for a maximum of 36 or 60 months, then leaving them trapped in the same cycles, a check of $1,000 for 12 months has been irrefutably shown to transform a family's socioeconomic status with lasting results. For Reverend Dr. King, economic security was of singular importance, but often conflated with jobs. And while I'm not going to go into workers' rights today, I do want to uplift that distinction he made so we have an accurate picture of poverty. Statistics that picture declining rates of unemployment veil the reality that Negro jobs are still substandard and evanescent, Dr. King said. He wrote, "The instability of employment reflects itself in the fragile character of Negro ambitions and economic foundations." End quote. Indeed, today, Black unemployment rates remain nearly double the white unemployment rate, and studies have shown that Black job seekers are just as likely to face discrimination in the labor market today as they were 30 years ago. In the United States, poverty has been historically higher and disproportionately concentrated in the American South. Despite this fact, much of the conventional research has focused on urban poverty in cities, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. We should keep in mind that every time we say the word poverty, we are talking about people and lived experience, not just a state of lack or indigence. We must not only do our part to help eradicate poverty, but we also seek to remove the expectation of poverty, the expectation that poverty must persist. If America hates poor people, Desmond may be correct in his conclusion that ending poverty will not only require new policies and political movements, but it will also require that each of us, in our own way, become poverty abolitionists, unwinding ourselves from our neighbor's deprivation and refusing to live as unwitting enemies of the poor. So I look forward to an engaging discussion with my panelists. And let me tell you, I really mean that. These are some brilliant minds, and I can't wait to hear about their work in this space, how they can see opportunities to advance Reverend Dr. King's call for economic justice. And I look forward to seeing how Emory Law School will work to produce the next generation of poverty abolitionists.
Thank you so much, Crystal. If you're like me, you had a few of those moments during that address. Now it's time for conversation, and following that, a brief Q&A. Allow me to briefly introduce the esteemed panel. Again, you can find their full bios at the QR code above. Our moderator today is Ifeoma Ajunwa, JD, PhD. Dr. Ajunwa is author of The Quantified Worker, published by Cambridge University Press. At Emory, she's Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Law, Associate Dean for Projects and Partnerships, and Founding Director of the AI and the Future of Work program at Emory Law. Ajunwa is currently a visiting fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. She's been a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University since 2017, and she's an elected member of the American Law Institute and a life fellow of the American Bar Foundation. Her research interests are at the intersection of law and technology, with a particular focus on the ethical governance, privacy, and discrimination issues associated with workplace AI and automated decision-making technologies. She also has an interest in law and literature and law and film. Our panelists include Dr. David McMillon, who's an assistant professor of economics at Emory University, where he teaches a newly designed course, The Economics of Systemic Racism. He received his doctoral degree at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He holds master's degrees from the University of Michigan in applied mathematics and in industrial and operations engineering, and a bachelor's in mathematical sciences. The goal of his work can be summarized as using systems thinking to combat systemic discrimination. But it's situated at the intersection of stratification economics, substantively, and applied theory, methodologically. Also, we have Tolton Pace. Tolton was appointed to the Atlanta Board of Education to fill the District 6 seat vacated by Eshe Collins after she was elected to the Atlanta City Council. He will serve on the school board through the end of 2025 to complete Collins's 4-year term. Pace was also recently elected as chair of the board for the Villages at Carver Family YMCA. The YMCA is located just minutes south of downtown Atlanta, close to the Atlanta Beltline, Georgia State University, and the AUC. It's proud to serve this growing and diverse community with programs focused on youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. Judge Pierce Hand Seitz was appointed to serve as judge in the Municipal Court of Atlanta by Mayor Andre Dickens in 2024. Judge Seitz presides over the Housing and Code Enforcement Division. He's an Atlanta native and earned his undergraduate degree in Spanish from Emory University and earned his Juris Doctor degree from Georgia State University College of Law. I will now turn this over to Dr. Ajunwa, and we'll join you again at the close of the discussion.
Thank you so much for those introductions, Kenyatta. Much appreciated. And, first, before we start, I want to just express my heartfelt gratitude and heartfelt thanks to Dean Greer, Dean Freer and Kenyatta Greer for arranging this event. Much of my work actually recently has focused on this issue of economic justice, and I have resurfaced in my work this idea that unfortunately, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been reduced to somewhat of a folk preacher when we remember him, and he's only known for, his platitudes on racial harmony. And in fact, he was actually a very, very fierce activist for poor folks, a very fierce activist for economic justice in this nation. So I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled and honored to be part of this celebration of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that rightfully recognizes his contributions to economic justice in this nation. And I want to thank our keynote speaker, Crystal McElrath, for highlighting especially that aspect of MLK's legacy. The idea that economic justice is something that is still being fought for in the United States, and that it is oftentimes overlooked in the discussion of civil rights. Because what did MLK say? He said, a hungry man is not a free man. I don't know if you guys know that speech that he gave. And so, yes, economic justice is very much a part of actually having civil rights for Black Americans. With that, I want to highlight and bring for discussion also 3 other themes that were part of this keynote. Those are the themes of housing, the themes of intergenerational mobility, or the ability to build generational wealth, particularly in terms of holding on to land, real estate being a very key component of how generational wealth is built and passed down in the United States. And then the issue of job access and workers' rights, and especially how all those 3 things intersect to continue to maintain systemic poverty in the United States, particularly as affecting Black Americans. So I'll start with Judge Seitz. Am I hopefully pronouncing that right correctly?
You are. I feel like I'm in the hot seat now.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, first, I want to acknowledge, your impactful work focused on housing, and affordable housing, fair housing in the Atlanta area. And, my question for you really is, what are the major challenges that you see in accomplishing this dream that MLK had? And for people who are not aware, MLK actually fought for the Fair Housing Act, and that law was passed about a week after his assassination. That's something that's not highlighted about his legacy, but that is very much a part of his legacy. And that is obviously a big issue in Atlanta metro area as housing becomes more and more, expensive and out of reach for a lot of, Atlanta legacy families that have been here and are feeling like pushed out. So what do you see as the major challenges, and any sort of strategies and thoughts you can also offer from your work?
Absolutely. That's a loaded question, so I'll try to be succinct and give the caveat that many of one, I'm recently appointed to the Atlanta Municipal Court. I've been appointed since May of last year. I just took over the Housing and Code Division as of 2 weeks ago. So take that with take that as you will. But I'll say most of my statements today really come from my experience as an attorney, pre-appointment as a judge, I started in private practice. I worked for a firm where I represented a lot of landowners, lending institutions, and then midway through my practice, I began doing the kind of the opposite end, I'd say, of the work, working for tenants, mainly tenants' rights, here in Georgia with Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. And some of my work might have overlapped with Attorney McElrath, but I would say hers is much more nationalized and research based. I just like to get in the courtroom and argue. So that's my background. And you're right, Dr. King had a lot of work in his later years focused on fair housing. And so a lot of it was centered around the Chicago Freedom Movement, which quickly was around the mid-60s. Dr. King focused on multiple things during that movement, but one of them was housing. And, you know, they do simple things like he and other civil rights leaders would send Black individuals into certain communities that were white, middle class, predominantly white neighborhoods, and they would have them apply, work with real estate agencies to try to get housing in those neighborhoods. And those individuals were told, we don't have listings in these neighborhoods, sorry, we don't have anything available. And then they would send out white staffers, and you know, within minutes, those staffers would get listings in those same communities that the immediately present Black folks who were looking for listings were denied access to. And so that's somewhat of a more direct example that Dr. King called attention to with local government individuals, obviously President Johnson at the time, and put a lot of pressure on key leaders to pass the Fair Housing Act in '68. It was after his death when it passed, but a lot of that work focused more on, well, was meant to address what Dr. King termed as systemic discrimination. And that's what the Fair Housing Act was aimed at, specifically around race. Of course, it spans other categories, but mainly around race. Nowadays, when I feel that folks bring up discrimination in housing, in fair and affordable housing, it's not that direct, right? We don't see many cases where, at least more nationalized cases, certainly not in my courtroom, we wouldn't handle them, where folks are just directly stated, you know, told that they're denied access because of race. However, for my time working as an attorney, you know, you realize that Metro Atlanta is 54% renters, right? And so, and then when you look at who makes up that renter group, Black and brown folks are 2 times more likely to be renters than their white counterparts. So when we're really talking about housing as it impacts non-white folks, we're really talking about renting for the most part, and barriers that may even create for owning homes later on down the line. So a lot of my work at AVLF focused on retaining housing, specifically rental and sometimes home ownership, for folks who are in low-income communities, which is correlated with race here in the city of Atlanta. So often Black communities, to protect their housing so that they can make it to the stage of actually buying a home and building wealth through that mechanism. And so to get to your question, sorry, from attorney perspective, a lot of the barriers that I saw that existed for many of the tenants who I represented who felt like they were, their communities that were mostly Black communities were targeted and prevented from housing were, one, it's commonly, most scholars would agree that here in the state of Georgia, local municipalities are preempted from rent control, right? A landlord can charge you $1,000 this year and $5,000 next. And we've seen that happen in some of our inner city communities. And that is a way that low income, often Black and brown communities are boxed out of certain communities. You know, and sometimes, you know, if you are a renter and you are applying for housing in a certain community and you're denied housing application, a lot of landowners, when I was an attorney, did not tell you why you were denied housing. you just get a denial. And so to really get the documents to figure out why your housing application was denied, be it for a federally subsidized property or not, which federally subsidized properties are required to comply with the Fair Housing Act. You have to get an attorney, and you have to litigate, and you have to do discovery and get documents. Most folks don't have those resources. So what we're talking about is a group of folks who, although they may know what the law says and they may state the law to the folks who are in control of their housing, they're just effectively denied the right to vindicate those rights, or I guess exercise those rights is a better term. Another is, eviction history is a huge problem for folks. You can have never missed a rental payment and have one squabble with a landlord, and instantly you have an eviction history. Because here in the state of Georgia, you can file an eviction for any reason, right? You just have to file an affidavit saying that you're the landlord, this is a tenant, and they did X. These are allegations. And future property owners, what they look at is not necessarily the outcome of those filings, whether it was dismissed by the landlord, right, or whether it was wrongfully filed. That's happened before, where it was an error, or maybe it was just to threaten the tenant into doing whatever the landlord wanted to do. Again, this is from my experience as an attorney, not as in my current role. And so we had a lot of tenants up to having custody threatened for their kids, because it is true, you can, if you don't have safe and consistent housing, you can lose custody of your children. And so, and I've represented those clients who were fearful that if they said or did anything to call attention to their unsafe and unsanitary living conditions, that, they would lose their kids. It's a real reality for some folks. And so, a lot of my work really came from this position of housing being the foundation for all the other things that kind of add up to economic freedom, right? So education. Kids can't go to the best schools, right, unless they live in the best areas where the best schools are, or they're able to stay in that area, right? They're not boxed out through rental prices and other issues. Jobs, right? If you lose your housing, you may not stay near your job anymore. You may have to change jobs, regardless of whether it was a high-paying job or not. We talked about the family piece, but another is health, physical and mental health. In Georgia, we have a lot of instances where, folks allege that their health is being impacted by housing. And I've seen it happen through some of my clients who we've been fortunate enough to get mold tests for, or doctor letters for. Poor housing really can impact occupants of a home unit. And so, whether it's mold infecting your, allergies on up to longstanding health issues. But again, to exercise your rights against those things, you need access to resources. You need lawyers. You need folks at the Southern Poverty Law Center who will, do studies of communities and issue reports, or folks at AVLF who would take on pro bono matters, or Atlanta Legal Aid. So sorry I took all of that time. I can talk about housing all day, but that's from the attorney perspective, some barriers that exist.
Thank you so much. On that note, I do want, I guess, to highlight, right, statistics of what exactly the economic state of Black Americans are in the United States. I would say that Crystal, started us off on that with some eye-opening statistics, from her work. I would like to turn to David to share some of the statistics, economic statistics that he has seen as part of his work, and then also some of the theories that he's been grappling with regarding intergenerational mobility, and just thinking about the status of, economic exclusion of Black Americans?
Well, thank you for that question, Dr. Ajunwa, also for your keynote, Crystal, and thank you all for having me as a part of this panel. So here's how I would respond to that. I'll start with just some of my work on systemic discrimination. So Albert Einstein once said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And so any idiot can break a glass jar on the floor, just smash it to pieces. But then if you're asked to put it back together again, right, that takes a lot more expertise. It takes something a lot more subtle, something more than positive intent also. And so this is sort of the angle that I approach my work with. That, you know, even if we have lots of people in the world who want to help improve, you know, equality, equity, things like that, it may not necessarily be as technically easy as a lot of people would like to make it. You know, this asymmetry I just identified in that analogy with breaking a glass jar is basically a consequence of the fact that we live in a highly nonlinear, interconnected world where people are interdependent and also outcomes are interdependent, right? And in our criminal justice system, you know, the decision makers, the decisions that they make are interdependent. Whether a judge is even going to make a certain decision depends on something that a prosecutor has done and so on. And so, you know, if I get fired from my job because of my race, what that means is that this will not just impact me, but it impacts everyone who was relying on me, right, for economic support and things like that. So what all this means is that we consistently underestimate the long-term effects of temporary injustices. And so, you know, years and years and years after you know, the civil rights movement, and certainly after the abolition of slavery, we see all this persistent inequality, and we're tempted to argue about, you know, the fact that we see all this persistence. Maybe it has to do with just the fact that there's still all this widespread direct discrimination. Of course, there's evidence on this, but even after that discrimination disappears, the fact that there's so much interconnection in the world can actually amplify the initial effects of those injustices. And so that's what I focus on in my work. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. In the context of the debate about reparations for slavery and Jim Crow in economics, this is sort of a newly growing literature. People are asking, you know, if we actually decided to attack racial wealth inequality at its root in a sense by just giving reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. There are a lot of concerns, you know, would the funds, you know, be, you know, spent the wrong way? Is there a lack of financial literacy and these kinds of things? Without getting too much into that debate, here's one thing that my work sheds light on. So first of all, there are so many mechanisms through which wealth leads to more wealth, right? Capital gains is one obvious example. It disproportionately impacts the wealthiest people. The fact that when you are wealthier, it's easier to live in a wealthy neighborhood, to be a homeowner in the first place, and then to invest in your kids' education in a complementary way. But then also, you know, it's easier to become an entrepreneur. And then, of course, in turn, entrepreneurship results in more wealth. So these are called reinforcement processes, feedback loops. If you have systematically barred a certain group from access to wealth for 7/8 of America's history, even if you suddenly stop doing that one day, these reinforcement processes are going to sustain the initial effects of those injustices. I have a colleague named Elora Durenencourt who actually shows that those inequalities are projected to remain for hundreds of years, even if it were the case that, for instance, Black and white people spent their money the same way, saved the same way, and so on. And so that's because of this capital gains rate. All right, so, you know, in my work, I'm not just complaining about how, you know, it's not about this doom and gloom story about how terrible everything is. In fact, there's a real upside to this, to thinking about systemic discrimination in this way. If you recognize that a temporary injustice can have a permanent effect because of some mechanisms that amplify its effects, then you have two options. You can either disrupt the amplification mechanisms themselves, or you can actually exploit them, because the same mechanisms that amplify inequities in the status quo can be exploited to amplify the effects of equity-focused interventions instead. And so that's a long-winded way of me arguing, for example, that a reparations policy for slavery and Jim Crow would also be able to benefit from all of these wealth leads to more wealth mechanisms that the econ literature has investigated profusely, right? So I could go on and on about lots of these different kinds of mechanisms. I'll just say one more. There is a paper that shows that a couple of generations after slavery ended, the former slave masters were able to regain their initial wealth, largely because they were connected in a social network sense to other wealthy people, okay? And so segregated wealth transfer networks, that's another mechanism that can sustain the initial effects of inequity, right? Now, at the same time, symmetrically speaking, there's research that argues that when Black Americans are able to achieve social mobility, it's harder for them to hold on to it across generations, partly because they're more likely to live in communities where other people are asking them for money. And I would honestly just assume that there's some people up here who might have experienced something like that. I certainly have, and so if it's simultaneously the case that when you're connected to a wealthier community, it's harder for you to lose your wealth. And it's also the case that when you're part of a more broken community, that it's harder to hold on to the wealth. Then that speaks to what economists call social multipliers. Basically, because people are interconnected, it is the case that a temporary injustice in terms of wealth inequality, say the Tulsa massacre happens. These kinds of things, the long-term effects of that can be sustained partly because of social interactions. And that also means if we decide to do a research study on something like reparations for slavery and Jim Crow, we may underestimate the long-term effects if we just conduct an intervention that randomizes, maybe you assign a reparations intervention for one person who's in an otherwise broken community and another who's in an otherwise broken community, right? You're going to get different effects than in a more realistic scenario that's more reflective of reparations, where you uplift an entire community. And now if any one person does suffer from financial illiteracy and so on, the fact that they're connected to other people who have also benefited from this, right, will affect them. Now, everything I just said actually doesn't just apply to wealth, right? These kinds of things can apply to any kind of outcome of interest, of well-being, and so on. So that's a little bit of my work. So hopefully that touches to some degree on intergenerational mobility too. The one last thing I want to say that my work investigates is the consequences of interconnected decisions, so multi-step decision processes. So take the school to prison pipeline, for example. So this is a situation where a student is having experiences throughout an interconnected system. It may start with a teacher who may or may not be biased, who may or may not send the student to the principal's office. Principal may or may not be biased. And as a result of a buildup of suspensions or so on, the student may or may not drop out from school, may or may not be more likely to interact with the police officer who may or may not be biased. And now, as a result of that interaction, they may end up in a prosecutor interaction who may or may not be biased, and eventually in front of a judge. Now, if you have this interconnected sequence of decisions, one thing that my work can demonstrate is, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but the earlier decision makers can have more systemic leverage over the total effect of discrimination in the system. And so you can have a very biased judge, for example. And even though you have a very biased judge, you could have a much less biased prosecutor or teacher, for example, who's actually exerting more of an influence over the sentencing disparities that we eventually see. Okay, so it has some measurement and policy applications that I think are interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. That was certainly, I think, an eye-opening and thought-provoking approach. I think, especially to thinking about reparations. I think it really sort of like pushes forth the idea of thinking about reparations not just as some sort of like individual grant, but really more as a community-based intervention that really impacts a group of people as opposed to perhaps how it's maybe most represented in like popular media as just sort of like a handout to like a specific individual. So thank you very much for that. Following that theme, of really disrupting, right? Either the multipliers of discrimination or systemic inequality, as you have mentioned. I want to turn my attention to Tolton as a senior program officer for the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. Since moving to Atlanta, I've been in Atlanta now for a year and a half. I have certainly noticed the name Arthur M. Blank. I would see really the foundation as having changed the skyline of Atlanta. It's hard to miss the impact that the foundation has had on the city. Its many philanthropic endeavors are very visible, very prominent. Recently there was a $24 million grant to address housing. And there's been other endeavors, the Children's Hospital, for one, that just opened last year. So, I would like to talk with you, right, more about the projects that Arthur M. Blank is taking as related to housing, but also I want to open it up. Are there other mechanisms that the foundation is thinking about when it comes to, as David has noted, disrupting these multipliers of discrimination, of inequality? And I'm thinking about, maybe job preparation, maybe education, investing in those sort of pathways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excited to chat with y'all today. I will do this as high level as possible and happy to answer any more questions afterward or engage in some one-on-one conversations. Does that sound good? Yeah, all right. And I'm highly interactive, by the way. So if I talk to you, feel free to respond back. It's okay. I know we're in the law school, it's a little different. I come from the college and the Rollins across the bridge, so do things a little differently, but we're gonna flow with it anyway. Sound all right? Yeah, good. Excellent, excellent. So just a high-level overview of the foundation. Arthur and Blake Family Foundation was started some 30 years ago, and we currently focus on 5 what we call collective giving areas. And I'll zero in on the one that I actually get to manage. But those 5 areas are mental health and well-being. It is youth development, it's democracy, environment, and then Atlanta's historic West Side. So all 4, except the West Side of those areas, take place, have some iteration across Georgia and across Montana. So those are kind of the 2 states that we operate in. I get the great privilege of focusing in a place-based way on Atlanta's historic West Side. Why is that important, particularly for this conversation today, is because Atlanta's historic West Side are 2 particular communities, English Avenue and Vine City, that if you're standing across the street at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, you look directly across Northside Drive, there's Vine City, and then to the right or north of that is English Avenue. Critical point. Vine City is where Dr. King's adult home is. It's where he raised his kids. It's where he and Kenyatta lived prior to his assassination. Why is that also important? This lovely man sitting to my right, who's one of my former students, actually, I'm glad I get to say that, right? Graduated from Washington High School, which sits in that West Side community. It's also the alma mater of Dr. King.
And lived in Vine City.
And lived in Vine City, right? And I am the product of growing up in that West Side as well. My mom was one of 10 kids. 8 of those 10 graduated from this same high school that Dr. King attended and chose intentionally to live in to put a focus and a highlight on poverty. So Pierce and I come from kind of this background and from these conditions. We are products of this environment and these circumstances that we're trying to impact and affect. So what does the work look like for us? We are focused on increasing the economic mobility of legacy residents who live in those 2 specific communities. These 2 communities, again, go way, way back where at the time the population was above 30,000. Currently, today, it's at about 7,000 between those 2 neighborhoods. Disinvestment over time, displacement over time, drug epidemic, a number of factors have kind of led to the depopulation of those neighborhoods. So our work focuses on helping to create stability for those legacy residents so that as the city changes, as gentrification happens, these residents don't get pushed out. They have a choice to stay. How do they do that? Through 2 pathways that we focus on. One is affordable housing, permanently affordable housing, and green when possible. And then the other pathway is financial inclusion, which breaks out into workforce development and income enhancement. So I'll give you quick examples of where we've kind of invested in those two spaces. My friend mentioned the $22+ million grants that we've done recently in those two areas. So one of those was a $10 million grant to the Westside Future Fund to focus on the preservation and production of affordable housing units, both apartments, which are rental units, as well as single-family homes, so that we can look at generational wealth, help folks have access to sustainable housing, right, from a rental perspective, but then graduate into moving into a single-family home that they can then begin to build generational wealth and pass down to their heirs, to their kids and others as well, right? So Westside Future Fund is primarily focused on that. 6.2 million went to the Westside Work/Atlanta Career Rise organization. Why is that important? Because it focuses on creating job opportunities, training, and plugging into employment in a number of different industries for residents in the Westside communities that we talked about, helping them to increase their wages, helping them to find what it is they're gifted at or what it is they might be interested in, getting certified in short-term programs and getting plugged in right away to jobs that can help them earn not a living wage, but a thriving wage. And then lastly, as a part of that 22.4 million, we invested 6.2 million in an organization called GROW, G-R-O, the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund. It is a guaranteed or universal basic income program that started in 04th Ward, where Dr. King's birth home was, and has grown across the state. So we invested in that program more recently to impact 200 women in Vine City and English Avenue, to provide them with $36,000 of extra income over a 3-year period of time. So about $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, 36 over a 3-year period with no strings attached. So as Dr. David talked about, these individuals who might be experiencing some type of hardship can use these additional resources at their discretion. Maybe it's to buy a car, maybe it's to pay for childcare, maybe it's to go back to school, maybe it's to save money, maybe it's to start a business as an entrepreneur. They have the opportunity and the will to now have some free agency, maybe to scale back on working multiple jobs, to be present for their kids at games, to spend more quality time at home in the evening, to cook dinner and have time with family. So we've kind of focused in on these two things because we figure if folks can have stable housing, if they can have stable jobs with a living, thriving wage, then those are two things that can help anchor and support the possibility and the opportunity for them to begin to stay in their communities, and we can start to see some change in these systems that have been in place for so long.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much for that. Truly appreciated hearing that. So I do want to open it up to Q&A, but I will take the questions. So if you want to just raise your hand and, oh, actually, we have mics. Great. Excellent.
Testing.
Thanks all. I've got two competing questions in my head. I really would love to dig into the reparations conversation more and just hear any thoughts that have bubbled up from y'all about that conversation and how we organize different centers of learning, different places where people have gained expertise, and like bring those resources together as like some of the local reparations efforts are happening. If you've seen anything like that, that was one competing question. The other is, what are we doing? Is anybody doing anything about RealPage AI and the way that, and particularly in Atlanta, our rental prices have been artificially manipulated by, biased AI to put people out of their homes because they have a monopoly on the rental market in Atlanta. So that's it. Thanks.
Great questions. Do you want to take that, David? The
I can
reparations.
sort of do that. I mean, I'm an academic. However, I have been involved a bit. I think so. We can talk after. I need to look up certain organizations, that are actually pretty active in the Atlanta area. They're just like not coming to mind right now because I've been tenure focused, for the last few months. But there's a lot of energy behind that. One thing I would say is that there is, so if you're familiar with William Darity's work, yeah, so William Darity is probably the foremost economist who's done work on reparations for slavery. He has this book, From Here to Equality, that I have my students read. that really lays out the case. It lays out both a moral case as well as an economic case. And so that includes all kinds of things that have happened to Black Americans that we also no longer really teach in schools, but also a number of different, private companies like Aetna who benefited from it, who were involved, universities and things like that. But then really gets into the different ways that the economy in general simply benefited from the advent of chattel slavery as well as Jim Crow. Now. There's another paper that I've been working on with him that's reviewing this research that at least I hope can open some minds about the idea, because there are a number of reports that are coming out that argue that if you close certain kinds of racial gaps, it benefits the economy as a whole in the present day, right? So in the present day, when we have this industrialized economy where we're really relying on skilled labor for economic growth, we're really cutting ourselves in the foot, as an economy by, say, just imprisoning a bunch of Black folks who could have been productive citizens. They're not paying taxes. You know what I mean? And so there are these sort of back of the envelope calculations that you can do that demonstrate that you would actually improve GDP in the long run if you attacked inequality and at certain levels. So that's what I would, I sort of more so think from the academic standpoint, and also from the standpoint of how can you convince someone sort of with numbers. But of course, that's not how people necessarily even get convinced. You have to build relationships with people. You have to actually get out there. So we can talk a bit after. I know that there are some organizations that do that.
And I guess I want to address your other question about, rent and the sort of influence of AI on all that. So, recently, New York has really taken an interest in this. So New York does already have rent control as one of their policies. But more recently, the governor of New York was talking about curtailing investment properties. So essentially the idea that properties in New York City specifically are being bought not by actual individuals, but by LLCs or other investment funds, and therefore being taken off the market in terms of like being able to be either rented out or circulating in the market. And so it's creating this artificially tight market. And so there was, she is trying to put forth like a law essentially banning that. So I do think we want to think about that, because that would also, I think, address this problem of maybe AI being used to manipulate the rental markets.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and your sharing examples from the different aspects of your work. In Dr. King's final monograph, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He set forth a vision for economic justice that in the housing space, even by itself, what he was calling for, $500,000 a year, 500,000 units built of housing a year for 10 years. Any new housing built in Black communities, abolished in 20 years and rebuilt. Integrated housing in suburban areas. National guaranteed income, Medicare for housing, that kind of scale, and calling for new kinds of coalitions. My question is about where will this leadership come from in our time?
That's a great question.
I think perhaps we'll go to Crystal to start us off on that, and there'll be opportunity.
Yeah, I hope it starts here. I think about some of the specific calls to action from Reverend Dr. King that you just mentioned. And even then I began to think about areas that I've seen, even referencing that book again, The Color of Law, referencing areas where I've worked in and then anecdotes, it seems that then there are so many ways in which people currently holding power work around those measures, right? We build up integrated housing in suburbs, and you're dealing with all kinds of iterations of white flight, and frankly, landowners and banks, even local governments who said, make me. And so I think the leaders come from a coalition of both people who are elected officials or willing to be in those roles, and then also those armed with expertise in areas from economics to law to community organizing, because community power is paramount. I mean, that's just irreplaceable in the equation. The community leaders have to come from cross sections of government leaders, lawyers, community organizers, economists, and then safe places like this, where there can be think tanks and collaboration that empowers and encourages and inspires and plants seeds. Because, I mean, while I am running ragged, I'm just playing whack-a-mole. And so who's got next? Who's going to pick it up and run in a different area and in a different fight? So that's my thoughts.
I'd like to jump into quickly, briefly, because Attorney McElrath hit on a point that's really important, and we don't often highlight this enough. But when I think back to many civil rights leaders, I think of folks who had to do civil rights, right? Because they couldn't be in the big law firms, or they couldn't do certain other things, and their community needed them, right? And so I'm coming in this year as president-elect of Gate City Bar Association, Black Bar Association, founded by 10 members who had really individualized practice, but found time to defend people in discrimination lawsuits, found time to represent a lot of folks who were told you can't attend UGA law because you're Black. And so these are folks who weren't paid for that work, right, directly, but did it. A big issue that I see, especially with my generation, and Tolton dated himself when he said that I was a freshman when he was in Emory admissions. But, how do you tell that person, don't go make, $200,000, $300,000 as an associate in a big law firm, but go and fight discrimination, right? And you can do both, but you can't do both well, in my opinion. I started out in a private firm doing pro bono cases and left because I felt like I wasn't doing the most that I could, and also that I had just paid off my student loans, right? So, there is a real problem of deciding, and even in this role as a judge right now, I think every judge on every bench will tell you that they could go and make double whatever they're making elsewhere. It's the same thing with folks who are in the pro bono space. So it's not just, I mean, we have the talent. I know it. I see the law students, I see the young attorneys who want to take on this mantle and do well, but can they live and eat at the same time? That's a real problem. A lot of young attorneys who want to be leaders. Ishe Collins, you mentioned earlier, just became a council member. They just increased the pay for that role, right? So that means the people who were in those roles originally, right, the money wasn't an issue for them. And sometimes those aren't the people who are looking to take up the mantle as well. And I'll leave it there.
Just two quick thoughts. Talk about the cross section of where leadership could come from. I'm reminded of kind of two things. One, we've got to do seed planting. And when I say seed planting, I mean that Pierce and I were both MLK scholars here in the college at Emory. right? And so as students here, we had the opportunity to be poured into by folks like those sitting in the audience, staff members, professors, and others who talk not only about the legacy of MLK, right? And at Emory that we do well, but we also do good, right? And what does that mean to do that, right? So as those seeds were planted, Pierce could sit in the corporate law firm, but then something in his mind is turning to say, hey, I remember what I learned sitting in Whitehall, room 101, that freshman year about such and such, right? So seed planting, I think, makes a huge difference wherever that gets planted, whether it's in our local public school system, whether it's, you know, a large scale university or otherwise. So I think that's hugely important. The other piece I think is voice amplifying, right? And when I say that, I mean amplifying the work that is being done so that we can invite others to join us in that work, right? And that's something that we've been really focused on within this last year at the Blank Foundation, where, you know, we've given, say, about 106 million since we started giving to the West Side several years ago, but we've been able to leverage over 200 million of gifts from other philanthropic entities, right? So how do we tell the story of what's happening, the work that's going on, what we're doing, and get others to invest either financially or from a human resource perspective to say, this is worth your time, this is worth your attention, this is worth your energy. What influence do we have? Who do we know that we can invite to join us in this work and bring them along and tell the story of how this impact could change things?
Excellent. Did you want to chime in? Otherwise, I will. Okay. Yeah, you know, I'll very briefly chime in, and it is to say, we are the ones we have been waiting for, right? It's us, right? So, you know, MLK outlined his vision. Unfortunately, he's not alive, you know, to see it realized. So we are the ones. And of course, you know, people will differ, right, in their economic ability, in their cognitive ability, in their time, you know, allowance. Everybody's, you know, fighting a different battle already. But we are the ones. So we are all going to have to contribute in whatever way we can, to the continued struggle, right? So it's us. Any other comments? All right. So, well, one more question, please. Yes.
Thank you to all of you guys for being here. I've learned a lot, and I'm actually not a law student. I'm a senior undergrad. Just wanted to come and learn from you guys today, so thank you. My question is for you, Attorney McElrath. Your speech was fantastic, so thank you. You mentioned about you mentioned the phrase being a poverty abolitionist, and I'm motivated coming out of Emory. I've gotten a fantastic education here to try and, you know, make a small impact in the community I go to next. So I'm curious, any advice you or any other panelists have on what are some tangible things we can do to A, be an ally, and B, just try and make a small impact on our local community?
Wow. Well, that's fantastic. A great question, I think, to wrap up with. There are so many resources in terms of educating ourselves. For me, I'm a bookworm, and so for me, that's been it. Just give me a good book that kind of really breaks this down. Poverty by America is the title of the book by Matthew Desmond. Phenomenal, and very digestible. Some of the other books that I mentioned were a little more intense, but that's a great one to just start with. And it's just, you know, it just breaks it down. You know, this is what it really looks like, not just theorizing. And then, you know, I will say that in Atlanta, there are a lot of organizations that are looking for volunteers, who are looking to provide internships, fellowships, externships, that are really doing great work. Tolton's probably got more resources, you know, that can connect you on the West Side. I know, you know, SPLC is actually building its new office next year on English Ave, and we'll be moving to the West Side. And so we've been building relationship and really getting to understand community. I think, and I will, you know, jump and say that perhaps Reverend Dr. King's agenda also included just community too. And so even when Dr. King says just far too many good and reasonable people don't understand what the experience of poverty is, I think that's where it starts. And so being in community with people, being present, and finding ways to understand better is, I think, the foundation. And then, like I said, I'll give you my card, and I just text people. I don't say hello. I just forward in like internships. And I hope that's effective or appreciated. But 8 o'clock on a Sunday night, just here, lawyers committees looking for people. I'm happy to just share resources and the groups. Absolutely, would love to. Just that are looking for groups. I see some that are looking, right now is the season where they're looking for law students for their summer 2025. Those are all right now. And then there are also some that are just looking for college students and recent grads. So I'm happy to forward. I'll compile them that I've been.
We'll collect that on attendees.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much. This has been an amazing discussion. Before we close, I just want to shout out again. Thank you so much. I see Dr. Carol Henderson, the CDO, the Chief Diversity Officer at the university is here with us today. Thank you. And thank you all. I will just say, I will quote Dr. King's farewell address to say to you in parting, I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. We are determined to be people. We're saying that we are God's children. And that we are God's children, we don't have to live like we are forced to live. For when people get caught up with that which is right, and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory. Thank you so much.